The first time I heard it, I was alone in the relay room at 3 in the morning, and I told myself it was probably nothing. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the signal, not what came after, just that small, ordinary moment where I sat with a lukewarm cup of coffee in my hand and decided, against everything I had been trained to do, that what I was hearing was probably nothing. My name is Daniel Roth. I worked as a signal analyst at the Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex from 2017 until the program quietly removed me from the active roster in 2023. I'm not supposed to talk about what happened during the last 11 months of my employment. I signed documents. I sat through interviews with people who didn't introduce themselves. I was told, in language that wasn't quite a threat but wasn't quite anything else, that the work I had done on a project designated KH-9/listener was sealed under a classification I had never seen before and was not authorized to ask about. I'm telling you this anyway, because I don't think it matters anymore. I think whatever protocol existed to contain this has already failed, in ways the people who designed it didn't anticipate. And I think the only thing left for someone like me to do is leave a record. A small one. A quiet one. Something that exists, in case the rest of it doesn't. The signal arrived on the night of October 14th, 2022. I remember the date because my sister had called earlier that evening to remind me about our mother's birthday, and I'd let it go to voicemail, the way I always did when I was on shift. I would never call her back. By the time I left Goldstone for the last time, I had stopped calling anyone. Goldstone sits in the Mojave Desert, about 30 miles north of Barstow. From the outside, it's just a series of white dishes scattered across miles of dry ochre land, like a child had set down dinner plates and forgotten them. The biggest dish, DSS-14, is 70 meters across. On a clear night, you can stand at the perimeter fence and watch it slowly rotate, tracking something invisible in the sky, and the silence around it is so complete that you start to hear your own heartbeat as a kind of intrusion. I worked in Building 230, in a windowless room about the size of a school classroom, full of consoles and the soft, constant hum of cooling fans. There were usually 4 of us on the overnight shift. That night there were 2. Me and a woman named Priya Anand, who had transferred in from JPL 6 months earlier and still hadn't bothered to put a single personal item on her desk. The signal came in on a frequency we weren't actively monitoring. That's the first thing that should have been impossible but wasn't, technically. The Deep Space Network listens to a wide spectrum, and sometimes anomalies bleed through from cosmic background noise, from old satellites we'd forgotten about, from terrestrial interference. We had a procedure for it. You logged the frequency, you noted the duration, you flagged it for the morning team, and you went back to whatever you were doing. I almost did exactly that. The signal was weak, less than 1/10 of a watt by the time it reached the dish. It came through on 1420.405 megahertz, which is the hydrogen line, the so-called watering hole that radio astronomers have monitored for decades because it's the frequency we'd most expect another civilization to use if they wanted to be heard. Most of what arrives there is noise, pulsars, quasars, the slow electromagnetic breath of the galaxy. This wasn't noise. It had structure. Not the kind you could hear exactly. The audio conversion is always artificial. We render these things into sound for the sake of human pattern recognition. But what we're really looking at is a waveform on a screen. The waveform had repetition, long pulses, short pulses, gaps. It wasn't Morse, but it had the same quality of intentionality, the same sense of someone trying to make themselves understood. I watched it for about 40 seconds before I called Priya over. She came around the partition and stood behind my chair without saying anything. She had a habit of leaning very close to the screen, close enough that her breath would fog a little on the glass, and I would always wait until she pulled back to ask what she thought. That night she didn't pull back for almost 2 minutes. When she did, all she said was, "Run the source triangulation," I ran it. The system needed about 15 minutes to cross-reference the signal's directional data against our orientation logs and the rotational position of the Earth at the time of reception. I remember Priya didn't go back to her desk. She stood next to mine, with her arms crossed, watching the progress bar. The result came back at 3:47 a.m. The signal's point of origin, as best the network could determine, was a region of sky in the constellation Bootes, approximately 124 light-years from Earth. The system identified the most likely source as a star catalogued as HD 131496, and it noted, in the small dispassionate text that the software always used, that this star had a confirmed exoplanet in its habitable zone, designated HD 131496b. Priya read the screen. Then she read it again. Then she walked back to her console without a word, and I heard her open a database query and start typing. I want to be clear about something. At that point in the night, neither of us was alarmed. We had received a structured signal from the direction of a known exoplanet. That, by itself, was the kind of thing that, if confirmed, would end careers and start others. But it was also the kind of thing that almost always turned out to be a satellite reflection, or an undergraduate's malfunctioning amateur radio, or a bird sitting on the receiver array. I had been at Goldstone for 5 years. I had personally flagged 11 anomalous signals in that time. Every one of them had a mundane explanation by the end of the next business day. So when Priya came back to my console 20 minutes later, with her face the color of the inside of a seashell, I assumed she was going to tell me she'd found the satellite or the radio or the bird. What she said instead was, "Daniel, HD 131496b doesn't exist anymore." I asked her what she meant. She turned her monitor so I could see it. She had pulled up the most recent observational data on the star system from a survey conducted in 2019 by the European Southern Observatory. The star was still there, still HD 131496, still where it had always been. But the planet, the gas giant in the habitable zone that had been confirmed in 2011, was gone. Not relocated, not occluded, not reclassified. Gone. The 2019 paper described the discrepancy in restrained, technical language. The authors had attempted to confirm the planet's transit signature and found nothing. They had repeated the observation. They had checked their equipment. They had checked the equipment of 3 other observatories. Eventually, they had published a quiet, almost embarrassed correction, suggesting that the original 2011 detection had probably been a measurement error or stellar activity mistaken for a transit. The paper had received almost no attention. Planets don't disappear. Therefore, the planet had never been there. Except, as Priya pointed out, the 2011 detection had been confirmed independently 4 times between 2011 and 2014. The mass had been measured. The orbital period had been measured. The atmospheric composition had been partially characterized through transit spectroscopy. There were 8 peer-reviewed papers describing a planet that, by 2019, the scientific community had quietly agreed had never existed. We sat with this for a while. I asked her what she wanted to do. She said, "I want to go home. I want to forget I saw this. And I want you to file it as background noise from a terrestrial source." I told her I couldn't do that. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said very softly, "I know. I just wanted to say it out loud." We worked through the rest of the night. By dawn, we had a clean recording of about 12 minutes of structured signal, isolated from background interference, with directional data confirming that whatever was generating it was either at or extremely close to the position where HD 131496b should have been, but no longer was. Priya went home at 6 in the morning. I stayed until 8, writing the report. I flagged it at the highest priority level I had clearance to use. By noon, I had been visited at my apartment by 2 men who showed me identification I didn't recognize, and asked very politely if I would be willing to come back to Goldstone that afternoon for a special briefing. They drove me there themselves. They did not say a single word during the 40-minute drive. That was how I was inducted into KH9/listener. The briefing took place in a part of Building 230 that I had walked past hundreds of times without ever wondering what was inside. The door looked like a maintenance closet. Behind it was a stairwell going down 2 levels into a section of the complex that, according to every floor plan I had ever been given, did not exist. The man who briefed me was about 60 years old, with the particular kind of tiredness that doesn't come from a single bad night, but from years of small accumulating wakefulness. He didn't tell me his name. He told me to call him Hollis, which I assumed was not his name. He never corrected me when I used it, and he never volunteered anything more. So for the 11 months I worked under him, Hollis is what he was. Hollis explained, in a voice that suggested he'd given this same speech more times than he wanted to remember, that the signal I had received the night before was not the first. It was the 43rd. I asked him over what time period. He said, since 1977. I want to describe the room we were in, because I think about it often. It was small, maybe 12 feet by 15, with concrete walls painted a flat institutional green. There was a single overhead fluorescent light that buzzed on a frequency just slightly off from the ones I was used to, so my ears kept trying to find the rhythm of it and failing. The desk between us was metal, government issue, the kind with a thin layer of dust in the corners that suggested no one had ever cared enough to clean it properly. On the wall behind Hollis was a framed photograph of a research vessel, taken from a distance, sitting on dark water under an overcast sky. There was no caption. I asked him about it once, weeks later. He said it was a ship called the Meridian, and that it had been decommissioned in 1984. He did not elaborate, and something in his face made me decide not to press. Hollis told me that the first signal had been received on August 20th, 1977, at the Big Ear Radio Telescope in Ohio. Most of the world knows that signal as the WOW signal, named after the notation a volunteer astronomer named Jerry Amon had written in the margin of the printout when he saw it. The WOW signal had lasted 72 seconds. It had originated from the constellation Sagittarius. It had never been heard again, despite decades of searches, and the scientific consensus had eventually settled on the explanation that it was probably a comet or a reflection from space debris or something equally mundane that we just hadn't been able to identify. That was the public version. Hollis told me that within 48 hours of the WOW signal's reception, a second signal had arrived at a different array in Australia on a different frequency with a different waveform, and then a third, 6 weeks later, in Puerto Rico. And then, with increasing irregularity, more. 43 over 45 years, each one structured, each one originating from a different point in the sky, each one, when triangulated and cross-referenced with astronomical surveys, traceable to a star system with a confirmed exoplanet. And each of those exoplanets, Hollis said, had subsequently been reobserved and found to no longer exist. I asked him to repeat that. He repeated it. I asked him what he thought it meant. He looked at me for a long moment, and I had the strange sense that he was deciding not whether to tell me the truth, but how much of the truth he could afford to tell me without breaking something inside himself that he had spent a long time keeping intact. He said, "We don't know what it means. We have theories. None of them are comfortable. The signal you received last night was the 43rd. The one before that was in March of 2021. The one before that was in November of 2019. The intervals are getting shorter." I asked him how much shorter. He said, "If the trend continues, the next one will arrive in approximately 4 months." I worked at KH9/listener for the next 11 months. The work was, in most ways, indistinguishable from the work I had been doing before. I sat at consoles. I monitored frequencies. I wrote reports. The difference was that everything I did was now classified, and that the questions I was trying to answer had no answers, and that I went home each night to an apartment that felt smaller than it had the day before. There were 6 other analysts in the program. I'll call them by the names I knew them by, which were almost certainly not their real names. There was Hollis, who ran the operation. There was a woman named Karen, who specialized in signal decryption and had, before being recruited, written her doctoral dissertation on the linguistic structures of beached whale vocalizations. There was a man named Pelletier, who never spoke about his background and who I eventually came to understand had been a Navy officer of some kind. There was Yuki, the youngest of us, an astrophysicist who had been pulled out of a postdoctoral position at Caltech with no warning. There was a man named Drake, who I think was the program's psychologist, although his official role was never explained to me. And there was Priya, who had been part of the program for 6 months before she'd been assigned to my shift, which I now understood had not been a coincidence. We met every morning at 7 a.m. in the underground room. Hollis would brief us on overnight developments. We would discuss the current state of the analysis. Then we would go to our individual workstations and spend the day staring at waveforms. The signals had a structure that we never managed to decode. Karen spent thousands of hours on it. She tried every form of language analysis she knew, and several she invented for the purpose. She compared the signals to human languages, to mathematical sequences, to musical structures, to the vocalizations of every species on Earth that produced sound for communication. She found correspondences that were tantalizing and ultimately meaningless. The signals had repetition, but the repetition didn't quite repeat. The signals had what looked like phonemes, but the phonemes never quite formed words. It was like trying to read a book in a language you almost recognized, where every word was almost a word you knew, but never exactly. Yuki, meanwhile, was working on the astronomical side. She built a database of every exoplanet that had ever been confirmed and subsequently retracted, going back to the first detection in 1992. She found that there were, across the entire history of exoplanet astronomy, several hundred such retractions. Most of them had ordinary explanations, equipment errors, stellar activity, misinterpreted data. But 43 of them, the same 43 that corresponded to the signals, shared a particular pattern. In each case, the planet had been confirmed multiple times by independent observers using different methods. In each case, the retraction had come years later, with the explanation that the original detection had been an error. In each case, the original observers, when contacted, expressed a strange kind of uncertainty about their own data. They didn't say they had been wrong exactly. They said something more like, "I no longer remember being as certain as my papers suggested I was." Yuki interviewed 3 of them, with Hollis's permission, under the cover of a routine NASA outreach project. She told me, after the 3rd interview, that she had stopped because she couldn't bear it anymore. The astronomers she spoke to weren't lying. They weren't covering anything up. They genuinely could not remember why they had been so confident decades earlier that they had detected planets that, by every current measurement, were not there. One of them, a man in his 70s who had been a leading figure in the field in the 1990s, had cried during the interview. He had said, "I know I saw it. I can't tell you how I know. I just know, but I can't show you. I can't show you anymore." Yuki transcribed the interviews and put them in the program archive. I read them all on a slow night in February, and I think about them more than I think about almost anything else. There is a thing that happens to you when you spend long enough working on a problem like this. You start to notice that the world has more edges than you previously believed. Small inconsistencies that you used to dismiss start to accumulate. You walk through a grocery store and the music playing overhead seems, for a moment, to repeat a phrase that doesn't quite belong in the song. You wake up at 4 in the morning, convinced you've heard your name spoken in the next room. And when you go to check, the only thing there is the slow blink of your microwave's clock. You look at the night sky and you start to wonder, against all rational sense, whether the stars you're looking at are really there, or whether you're looking at the light of stars that have already, by some mechanism you don't understand, been quietly subtracted from the universe. I didn't sleep well during those 11 months. None of us did. Drake, the psychologist, would conduct what he called wellness checks once a week, and we all understood, without ever discussing it, that the wellness checks were really an early warning system. The program had a history. People had broken before. Hollis once mentioned, in a moment of unusual openness, that the previous lead analyst had been removed from the program in 2018 after she had begun keeping a journal in which she addressed the signals directly, asking them questions and then leaving long blank spaces for their answers. The blank spaces, Hollis said, had eventually started to fill themselves in handwriting that was not hers. I told him I didn't believe that. He said, "I don't blame you. I didn't either, until I read the journal." The 8th signal during my time on the program, the 51st overall, arrived on the night of June 4th, 2023. It was different. The previous signals had been short. The longest had lasted just under 19 minutes. They had originated from systems between 60 and 300 light years away. They had been weak, only barely detectable above the cosmic background. They had felt, if I can use that word, like distant calls. The kind of thing you would hear at the edge of a wide field at night, where you couldn't tell whether someone was calling for help or just calling out. The June 4th signal lasted 47 minutes. It originated from a system 11.9 light years away, a star called Ross 128, which had a confirmed terrestrial exoplanet in its habitable zone, designated Ross 128b. The planet had been confirmed in 2017. It was, at that time, considered one of the most promising candidates for habitability outside our own solar system. It was close. It was the right size. It orbited a quiet star. The June 4th signal was strong enough to be detected by amateur radio operators. We monitored the public response in real time. By 4 a.m., a hobbyist in Wellington, New Zealand had posted a recording online. By 6 a.m., the recording had been removed, and the hobbyist's social media accounts had gone quiet. I don't know what happened to him. I tried to find out later. I couldn't. The signal had structure that the previous signals hadn't. Karen, working through the night without stopping, identified what she believed were repeating segments. Not phonemes this time, something more like sentences. She isolated 3 of them, and although she couldn't translate them, she could play them back as audio, rendered through the standard signal-to-sound conversion. I heard them on the morning of June 5th in the underground briefing room. The first sounded like wind through a long corridor. The second sounded like a voice speaking from underwater, the words soft and nearly recognizable. The third sounded like a child counting. I am writing that down because it is what I heard. I am not saying that it was any of those things. I am saying that the human mind, when presented with sounds it cannot interpret, will reach for the nearest familiar shape, and the shapes I reached for that morning were wind, and a voice, and a child. Karen reached for different shapes. Hollis reached for different shapes still. None of us agreed on what we had heard. All of us, I think, agreed on what we felt, which was the particular cold weight of something trying to be understood. Yuki ran the cross-reference on Ross 128b that afternoon. She had been doing this for months by then, and her hands moved across the keyboard with the kind of unconscious speed that comes from doing the same set of operations hundreds of times. The result took longer than usual. The system was checking against multiple databases, including some that the program had built specifically for this work. When the result came back, Yuki read it twice, and then a third time, and then she turned to Hollis and said, "It's still there." Hollis didn't understand at first. None of us did. She said it again. Ross 128b. It's still there. It hasn't been retracted. The most recent observations confirm it. It's still there. There was a long silence in the room. I remember the buzzing of the fluorescent light and the soft hiss of the air conditioning and the faint sound of someone, I think Pelletier, breathing through his nose in a way that suggested he was trying very hard not to do anything else. Hollis said, "Run it again." Yuki ran it again. The result was the same. Hollis said, "Run it through the European archives and the Chinese archives and the legacy data from Kepler." Yuki ran it through all of them. The planet was still there in every data set, confirmed, observed, measured. It had not been retracted. It had not been quietly forgotten. It existed. What changed then was the meaning of everything we had been doing for the past 45 years. The previous interpretation, the one we had quietly settled into without ever quite agreeing on it, had been that the signals were arriving from planets that had been destroyed. That was the only way we knew how to think about it. A planet had existed, had broadcast something, and had then, somehow, ceased to exist, and the broadcast had reached us across the light years afterward, like a letter from someone who had died before it arrived. But Ross 128b was 11.9 light years away. The signal had been broadcast 11.9 years ago, and the planet was still there, which meant the planet had broadcast the signal and then continued to exist for at least another 12 years, and during those 12 years, it had still been observable. The sequence we had constructed, in which the broadcast caused or coincided with the disappearance, was wrong. Or, more precisely, it was incomplete. Yuki worked through the night to figure out what we had missed. She had a theory by morning. She presented it to us at the 7 a.m. briefing, in a voice that was steady but very careful, the way you speak when you're trying not to alarm yourself. She said, "The planets aren't disappearing because they broadcast the signal. The planets are disappearing later, years later, decades later. The broadcast comes first, and then, after some interval, the planet is removed from observable reality." She said, "In the case of Ross 128b, the broadcast happened 12 years ago. We are now hearing it, which means the planet, in 12 years, will probably stop being observable." She said, "In the case of every other planet in our database, the broadcast was received some time ago, and the planet had already disappeared by the time we received it, because the planets were further away. The light from the disappearance was still reaching us. The further away the planet, the older the broadcast, the longer ago the disappearance. The signals weren't messages from the dying. They were messages from the soon-to-be dying. We just hadn't been close enough to anything until now to hear one in time." Hollis sat with this for a while. He had a habit, when he was thinking about something difficult, of pressing his thumb very slowly into the soft flesh below his jaw, as if checking his own pulse. He did it for a long time that morning. Then he said, "How long is the interval?" Yuki said, "I can't determine that from the existing data. The intervals between broadcast and disappearance are inconsistent. In some cases, the planet seems to have been removed within a few years of the broadcast. In others, it might have been decades." "There isn't enough information," Hollis said. "What's the shortest interval you've documented?" Yuki hesitated. She said, 4 years. We did the math without anyone needing to say it out loud. The Ross 128b signal had been broadcast 12 years ago. If the interval was 4 years, the planet had already disappeared 8 years ago. We just hadn't seen it yet because the light hadn't reached us. Yuki continued working. She refined the model. She accounted for variables we hadn't previously considered. By the end of the week, she had narrowed the likely interval for Ross 128b to between 7 and 14 years from the broadcast date. She presented her results in a single page of careful, restrained scientific writing, and the conclusion was that the planet had almost certainly already ceased to exist. The light from its absence would reach us between 3 months and 7 years from the date of her analysis. This is the kind of thing you cannot really sit with. The mind doesn't have a place to put it. You go home, and you cook a meal, and you watch something on television, and the entire time there's a small voice in the back of your head saying, "A planet is not there anymore. I am one of perhaps a dozen people in the world who knows. I am watching a sitcom." Drake noticed the change in all of us. He started increasing the frequency of his check-ins. He started prescribing things quietly. He told me in his office that he was less worried about acute psychological breaks than about a kind of slow ontological erosion, in which we would gradually stop trusting the world to be the way it appeared to us. He used those words. Ontological erosion. I have thought about them often since. The signals continued. They had stopped feeling like discoveries by then and started feeling like obligations. Each one was a new system to research, a new astronomer to interview, a new entry in the database. We received the 52nd on July 19th, the 53rd on August 2nd, the 54th on August 11th. The intervals, as Hollis had warned me on my first day, were getting shorter. By the end of August, we were receiving signals at the rate of approximately 1 per week. Karen was no longer sleeping. She had moved a cot into the analysis room and would lie on it sometimes, with her eyes open, listening to the most recent signal on a loop through her headphones. She had stopped trying to translate them. When I asked her why, she said that she had begun to suspect that translation was the wrong frame. She said the signals weren't messages. They were something else. She said, "I think they're inventories." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I think someone is counting." She wouldn't elaborate. I asked her once in a quiet moment whether she meant counting planets, counting civilizations, counting something else. She looked at me with the particular tiredness that only she had, and she said, "Daniel, I don't think it matters what they're counting. I think what matters is that the count is going down." In early September, something changed in the signals themselves. We had built, over the course of the program's history, a kind of library of waveform structures. Every signal had its own fingerprint, its own pattern of pulses and silences and harmonic shifts. But there were also commonalities, recurring motifs, sequences that appeared with variations across multiple signals. We had begun to think of these as a kind of grammar, although Karen disliked that word. In early September, a new motif appeared. It was short, about 6 seconds long. It appeared at the beginning of every signal we received from that point forward, before the rest of the signal began. It was not present in any of the previous 54 signals. It was new, and it was consistent, and it sounded, when rendered as audio, like a single low tone followed by a brief silence, followed by 3 short tones in rapid succession. Karen spent 2 days analyzing it. On the 3rd day, she came into the briefing room with her laptop and asked us to listen to something. She played a recording. It was the new motif, the 6-second pattern that had begun appearing at the start of the recent signals. Then she played a second recording. It sounded almost identical. The same low tone, the same silence, the same 3 short tones. She said, "This is the new motif, recorded last week, from a signal originating in the constellation Lyra, approximately 96 light-years from Earth." She played the second recording again. She said, "This is a recording made on Earth in 1962 by the Soviet Deep Space Tracking Facility at Yevpatoria. It was a calibration signal. They broadcast it once into deep space as part of a test of their transmission equipment. They never repeated it. It was logged, archived, and forgotten. It exists in a single document, in a single archive, in a language most of us don't read. I found it because I've been looking for things like this for 8 months." She let the silence sit in the room for a while. She said, "The motif that has begun appearing at the start of every new signal we receive is a Soviet calibration broadcast from 1962. It is being returned to us by something from 96 light years away, and from somewhere else, and from somewhere else." I want to describe Hollis's face at that moment, because it was the only time in 11 months that I saw it change. His face had a kind of permanence to it, a weight. Whatever happened, he absorbed it, and his expression remained roughly the same. But when Karen said the word returned, something in his face slipped. It was small, a muscle near his temple, a slight tightening at the corner of his mouth. But I saw it, and I have never forgotten it. He said, very quietly, "How many of the new signals contain this motif?" Karen said, "All of them, since September 4th. Hollis said, "And the motif is identical in each one?" Karen said, "Bit for bit, within the precision our equipment can measure." Hollis said, "Which means it isn't being independently generated. It's being copied, forwarded, retransmitted." Karen said, "Yes." Hollis sat with this. The thumb went to his jaw again. After a long time, he said, "By something that has access to a 1962 Soviet calibration broadcast." Karen said, "Yes." Hollis said, "Which traveled outward from Earth at the speed of light, and which therefore could not have reached anywhere more than 61 light years away." Karen said, "Yes." Hollis said, "And which is now returning to us from points up to several hundred light years away." Karen said, "Yes." Hollis said, "Which is impossible." Karen said, "Yes." There was a long silence. I could hear, very faintly, the sound of the ventilation system and the distant hum of the 70-meter dish above us, slowly tracking something invisible across the night sky. Hollis said, "Has anyone else noticed?" Karen said, "Not yet, but they will. The signals are getting strong enough that amateur observers are starting to detect them. We removed one recording from the internet in June. We can't remove all of them. The Wellington recording from June 4th is still online on 3 different mirror sites, and we don't have the resources to keep up with it. By the end of the year, the existence of these signals will be public knowledge." Hollis said, "And by then?" Karen said, "By then we will be receiving signals continuously. The intervals will have collapsed. There will not be gaps between transmissions. There will only be the transmissions." Hollis said, "From how many sources?" Karen said, "All of them." I left the program, or was removed from it, in late September of 2023. The official explanation was that my clearance had been reviewed and downgraded. The unofficial explanation, given to me by Drake in his small office on my last day, was that I had begun to exhibit signs of what he called parasocial attachment to the source phenomenon, which he described as a pattern in which long-term analysts began to feel that the signals were addressing them personally. I told him I didn't think that was true. He said, "Daniel, you've started leaving recordings of the signals playing in your apartment overnight. We know because you've mentioned it during 3 of the last 5 wellness checks. You don't sleep with them on. You leave them on while you're at work so that when you come home, the apartment is full of them. Why do you do that?" I didn't have a good answer. I didn't have a bad one either. I just sat in his office and looked at the framed certificates on his wall, and I tried to remember when I had started doing it. I couldn't. He told me I would be reassigned, that my access to the underground rooms in Building 230 would be revoked, that I would be moved to a daytime position in the public-facing arm of the Deep Space Network, where I would work on routine telemetry analysis, and eventually, he hoped, recover. I asked him what would happen to the program. He said, "The program will continue, with or without you." I asked him what would happen to the others, to Karen, to Yuki, to Hollis. He said, I'm not authorized to discuss that. I asked him if I would ever see them again. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Daniel, I want you to listen to me carefully. The work you have done here has mattered. The people you have worked with have mattered. But the program is not designed to produce answers. It is designed to maintain a record, and you have contributed to that record, and now your contribution is complete. Go home, sleep, try to find something else to think about. There is nothing more for you here." I left Goldstone that afternoon. I drove the 40 miles back to my apartment in Barstow with the radio off, and I sat in the parking lot for a long time before I went inside. The apartment was quiet. I had not, despite Drake's claim, left a recording running that morning. The silence when I walked in was complete. I lived in that apartment for another 4 months. During that time, I tried, with mixed success, to stop thinking about the program. I went to the grocery store. I called my sister back finally, and we had a long, careful conversation in which I did not mention any of what I had done. I started running in the evenings, on the long, flat roads outside town, where the desert opened up to the south and the sky at dusk turned the color of an old bruise. I did not stop watching the news. In November, a story appeared on a science website about an unusual radio signal that had been detected by an amateur astronomer in Chile. The signal had been brief, structured, and had originated from the direction of the star Tau Ceti, which was about 12 light years from Earth and which had several confirmed planets in its habitable zone. The story was small. It was treated as a curiosity. By the next day, it had been displaced by other news. I tried to find the recording. I couldn't. The links were dead. The amateur astronomer's social media was empty. In December, a similar story appeared from an observatory in South Africa. Then another from Hawaii. Then a longer piece in a major newspaper, suggesting that the global astronomical community was experiencing what one researcher, anonymously, called an unusual concentration of anomalous detections. The piece quoted an official from NASA who said that there was no cause for concern and that all signals were being investigated through ordinary channels. I knew the official. He had visited the underground room in Building 2-3 twice during my time on the program. I remember he had been very quiet during the briefings, and that he had taken extensive notes in a small black notebook that he had taken with him when he left. In January of 2024, I drove out to Goldstone one night just to look at it. I parked at the perimeter fence in the dark with my headlights off. The big dish was rotating, slowly, the way it always had. The smaller dishes were arrayed around it like a kind of council. The air was very cold and very still. I sat in my car and I watched the dish. It turned through about 30 degrees over the course of an hour. I tried to figure out what it was tracking, but I had been off the network for too long, and I no longer had access to the orientation logs. After a while, I got out of the car and walked to the fence. The desert was completely silent. There was no wind, no traffic, no sound of any kind. Just the slow rotation of the dish and the soft tick of the cooling engine of my car and my own breath, very faintly, in the cold. I stood there for a long time. I want to tell you that I heard something that night at the fence. I want to tell you that there was a sound, a small one, just at the edge of my hearing. A low tone, perhaps. A brief silence. 3 short tones in rapid succession. I want to tell you that, but I'm not sure if it's true. I'm not sure if I heard it, or if I imagined it, or if my mind, which had been listening to the signals for so long, had simply learned to produce them on its own, the way Karen had described. An inventory, a counting, a long, quiet record of something being subtracted slowly from the world. I drove home. I went to bed. I slept, for the first time in months, without dreams. The signals are still arriving. I know this not because I have any access to the program, but because anyone with a sufficiently sensitive radio receiver can hear them now. They are no longer rare. They are the background. If you tune to the right frequencies, on a quiet night, you can hear the soft structured pulses arriving from every direction, from systems near and far, from stars whose names most people don't know. The astronomical community has, in the last several months, begun to publicly acknowledge what is happening. The papers are cautious. They use language like anomalous coincident detections and possible non-natural emission sources. They do not yet use the language we used in the underground room. They do not say returned. They do not say inventory. They do not say that something out there has access to a 1962 Soviet calibration broadcast and is sending it back to us slowly from every direction at once with longer and more complex messages attached. But they will. Eventually they will. The data will force them to. And when that happens, I think there will be a brief period of public alarm, followed by a longer period of public adjustment, followed by the slow return of ordinary life, because that is how human beings respond to things they cannot fully understand. We live with them. We build them into the background of our days. We keep doing the laundry. I don't know what the signals are. I worked on them for 11 months, and I do not know what they are. I have theories. None of them are comfortable. The most comfortable of them is that we are receiving the records of a process that has been operating in our galaxy for a very long time, longer than human civilization, longer than human beings, longer than complex life on this planet. A process that finds inhabited worlds and broadcasts something, and then, after some interval, removes them. I do not know if the broadcast is a warning, or an announcement, or something else. I do not know if it is meant for us, or if we are simply overhearing it. The least comfortable of my theories is that the broadcasts are not records. They are notifications. And the thing that does the removing is not separate from the thing that does the broadcasting. They are the same thing. And it has been counting for a very long time, and the count is approaching a number we will not like. The signal that arrived from Ross 128b, 12 light-years away, was broadcast 12 years ago. Ross 128b is, by Yuki's calculations, almost certainly already gone. We will see it disappear sometime in the next several years as the light from its absence reaches us. I do not know what that will look like. I imagine it will look like nothing. The star will still be there. The orbit will still be there. The space where the planet used to be will simply be empty, in a way that the most careful observers will eventually notice, and the rest of the world will not. I think about Hollis sometimes. I think about Karen, lying on her cot with the headphones on, listening to the inventory. I think about Yuki, running her queries through the night. I think about the woman whose journal I never read, the previous lead analyst, the one whose blank pages had supposedly started to fill themselves in. I do not know what they wrote in her journal. I have never asked. I am not sure I would believe the answer. I am not on the program anymore. I have no access. I have no clearance. I am, by every official measure, a private citizen with no special knowledge of any classified matter. But there is one thing I know, that I should not, and that I am writing down here because I do not know who else to tell. The motif, the 1962 Soviet calibration signal, the one Karen found, the one that had been quietly archived in a single document in a single forgotten facility, the one that had been broadcast once into deep space and never repeated. I went looking for it after I left the program. I had a friend in Eastern European studies who helped me find the original document. It took 6 months. The document was in a Russian state archive that had been digitized only in 2019. The calibration signal was described in a single paragraph, on a single page, in a 1963 internal report. According to the report, the calibration signal had been transmitted on November 22, 1962. It had been transmitted in the direction of the star HD 131496. The first system from which we at Goldstone received a signal in October of 2022. The signal returned to us 60 years after we sent it out, from the very place we had aimed it. And in the time between the broadcast and the return, the planet around that star had quietly, without anyone noticing, ceased to exist. I do not know what to do with this information. I do not know what it means. I have written it down here because I think someone else should know it, in case I am not able to tell anyone eventually in person. The dish at Goldstone is still turning. Tonight, somewhere, an analyst is sitting at a console, watching a waveform, trying to decide whether what they are seeing is noise or something else. I hope they call it noise. I hope they file it as background. I hope they go home and sleep and forget and live an ordinary life. But I know how the program works. I know what is in the underground room. I know that whatever they hear tonight will be added to the inventory, and the inventory will continue to grow, and somewhere out there, in a place we have not yet learned to look at properly, something is keeping count. I do not know what it is counting toward. I think sometimes that I almost want to know. That is the part that frightens me most.